So it's Sunday. The times have changed. Everything is crazy. It's topsy-turvy. But the one constant that you can depend on is that it's us. And we're going to be talking about some boxing. So, I mean, what more could you ask for on a Sunday morning? Steve Swift, holy smokes. How you doing, brother? You doing all right?
Yes, I'm very well, thank you. Our times didn't change. It's only in the crazy world of the US that the times have changed. Our times are still the same. Our times change at the end of March. So,
What is that?
why is it? Well, because we're the UK and we do what we bleeding well want. I mean, we do things differently, not as well, but we do things differently.
If you're the UK, does that make the rest of the world okay?
I wouldn't say that. Not checking out my Twitter feed or X. That name change is not really taken. And no, not considering my feed at all. The rest of the world is not generally okay.
Well, B says LFG, and we're going to actually because we're broadcast. Oh, hold on. We got to come up with a different word. We are expunging our knowledge of truth. I don't know because we can't call it. They get offended apparently, Steve, if we call it a broadcast.
It's a missive. It's a boxing missive.
Missive?
It's your daily boxing. It's your weekly boxing suppository that you must take.
All right. Well, yes, it is definitely from the same area that a suppository goes. There's no doubt about that. Speaking of craziness in the world of boxing, so it got announced, dude, that there's going to be a new league, apparently. We've got a new player in the mix. Okay, let me just run this down for you right now. Okay, these are the big. I'm not talking like your small promotions. These are the big players in the mix. You got Matchroom with Eddie Hearn. You got Top Rank with Bob Arum. PBC with Al Heyman. Queensberry with Frank Warren. And I'm running down a list here. And then we get into the dare I say the Oscar De La Hoyas of the world and Golden Boy. The TM Money Floyd Mayweather's company, right? New kid on the block from Boxer, Ben Shalom, who's making, and I want you to remember this name because this is one that I think is going to come up in the mix with what we're talking about a little bit here today, right? And then of course, the Dory Funk of wrestling promoters himself, Don King, the guy who's been around since Christ was a corporal, the guy that's been around since dirt was invented. You know what I mean? What can you say about Don King? But this is just without all of your locals, like for example, your Three Lions promotions that have, guys that we know about, like shout out Ryan Rozicki, you know what I mean? All of your smaller ones and stuff like that. And of course, one name that I didn't put on that list is His Excellency, Turki Al-Sheikh, who kind of like skated into there and, made some fights happen that everybody went, holy smokes, we got ourselves a new money guy. Boxing got a new money guy. And now it seems like some boxing people have maybe turned their noses up a little bit, their busted ass noses up a little bit because it looks like His Excellency has done a little bit of a side deal with TKO and Dana White, of all people, the man who started in the world as being a boxing promoter, got into the world of combat sports, has done fantastic things with the UFC, but now wants to get back into it because, he saw the same thing that everybody else saw, as far as I'm concerned, a money opportunity here. What do you know about this? What have you heard about this whole new league? And we're going to get into what we think it's going to be called and all of that. What do you know, Steve Swift?
Well, I suspect none of us know very much. he said, clearing his throat, touch of the catarrh and the phlegm, and yet I'm still here. The thing is, this was floated a while ago, and generally promoters and others went, we're not doing that. We would now, we'll get into why in a minute, but this is now the first step. So with Dana White, it's a big step in. So it's been floated before. Now we're putting down roots, and this feeds into, if we can believe this, if one can believe this, with apparently Turki Al-Sheikh's shaking of the head when the WBC belt was going to come on stage for Canelo to pose with. So a shake of the head. No, we don't want that. If that indeed happened, and it's reported that it did, then that would follow this. The thing is, I don't think that His Excellency is a promoter. He stands to one side and ahead of all this. In a way, he stands even ahead now, at the moment, right now, of the alphabet organizations, and we'll be talking about them, won't we? So he stands above them even. He's one of them, but stands above that. He's got so much money in a sport that wants that money so much that he is the man pulling all the strings. However, this will fall down on money, I believe.
Do you think that it's just a matter of like, because Eddie Hearn was the first one to come out and be like, "Oh, this isn't right. This is bad. This is gonna, if we're not fragmented. We're in wonderful positions right now." Do you think that this is just Eddie Hearn and some of these other promoters being a little bit butthurt because Dana beat him to the punch on their money guy?
First of all, since when did Eddie Hearn sound like Popeye? There's no problem with Eddie in the backseat. No problem at all. He doesn't speak like that. But I mean, congratulations on trying for a Cockney accent.
Yeah, what can I say?
Yes, there is a worry about this. I think that promoters came out when they first heard about this and said, no, that won't work. It simply won't work. And His Excellency went away and didn't do anything. And so I think they thought, this is all. Well, this is a big move and a quick move. And Eddie Hearn would be the one to come out first and use social media. He makes a very good point, though, around whether this is going to work or not. And I suspect we want to talk about what he said and how this might affect boxing and boxers deleteriously.
Look that one, ladies and gentlemen. Don't do it.
Deleteriously. That's 6 syllables, folks. 6 syllables.
Do you get a double? Do you use all 7? Do you use all 7 in Scrabble if you spell that one?
I don't know if you do, but I use all 7 of my sensors. That's what I use. I've got sensors working overtime, to quote XTC, my favorite band.
And I use all 7 of my deadly sins. So anyways, let's talk a little bit about the fact that if you think about it, you've got, like, who are your big, each one of those names that I said, they all have a promotion, right? Each one of them has a promotion. Matchroom is a promotion. And they have a lot of fights with their fighters inside of Matchroom. Matchroom fighters will fight Matchroom fighters. Queensberry fighters will fight Queensberry fighters. But I think they found out very quickly that they need to work together to make some of these bigger fights, correct? So if you break this down to its bare bones, each one of those promotions is a league of its own, is it not? So a lot of this really comes across as just being like, we don't want to let somebody new into the mix like this, especially somebody like Dana White, right?
Yes. And you're right about the promotions being a league. I've never thought of it like that. Quite right. And they do their own business, which makes money. More of that in a minute. But this actually, I think, is also about Dana White and His Excellency actually taking control of this. So if you've got a league, they're the ones, it's my view, we don't know what the rules are yet, but I think the concern is that those two individuals or anybody that His Excellency says, you do that with Dana, they'll be the ones to control this. So fighter A is fighting fighter B. And you won't be able to make these. You won't be able to do this, Matchroom. You won't be able to talk to each other, Queensberry. We'll decide what you do, and you will tug the forelock and say, thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you so much. That's their concern. At the moment, they make their own, and they are linked to TV channels, aren't they? Generally, you might in this country say Queensberry is linked to BT, and certainly Matchroom is linked to DAZN. But how's that going to work if His Excellency and Dana White are saying, we'll control this, we'll do this? It's disastrous for them.
Well, TKO has TV deals. They've got the biggest and best TV deals because you've got WWE deals, you've got UFC deals. They are the cream of the crop when it comes to distribution as far as television deals go. Right? There's a reason that I can watch the fight in so many different countries that aren't necessarily on pay-per-view. Sky Sports, wonderful channel. BT Sports, wonderful channel as well. You know what I mean? So distribution isn't a thing. So if you're trying to get into it, and a lot of these other promoters who don't like the idea of your league, but they love the idea of your money, right? Because you're His Excellency, you go to the guy who's like, yeah, let's make this work. Let's start a new thing. Let's go to the guy who down the line has a history of taking and starting and building quote, leagues. He's done it with the UFC. He talked about that just recently at the his press conference after UFC 313. He talked about it, and because he got asked, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, look at what we did with the UFC when we bought this for a bag of chips. We had 12 contracts. Look at what we are now. So he's in the business of making a business like this work. So that's very favorable to a guy who's got the money, and he's sitting there going, but I want to play. And they're like, oh, you can play with your money, but you can't be part of the club. Right?
Yes. So you form your own club, don't you? And
right.
You're quite right that promoters have a nice, gentle club. I mean, they have an agreement. I mean, it's you can't call it a cartel. I would never call it a cartel, but they talk to each other. I mean, we, as you say, Matchroom and Queensberry co-promoted recently.
Right.
I mean, it was a whitewash for 7-0, wasn't it, for Queensberry? But they did that. And, I'd like to see a bit more of that. If this happens, we won't see any of that. Unless you're saying, well, unless the league is basically, and this is one of the things Eddie Hearn is saying, the league will pick the best fighters. And every stable has got lots of fighters, some of whom might not get the opportunity if there's a cutoff point, or if they have to raise themselves up the league, they might not get the opportunity to fight for those big titles. And there'll only be one in each weight class is something else that they're talking about, that His Excellency is talking about. So they might miss out on big matches.
Okay.
And I suppose outside of this league, what promoters could do is say, well, we'll do our own stuff then. We'll take part in that league. But actually, I'm more interested in these fighters who hate each other, who are kind of would be mid-league or wouldn't even be in the league. But I think a load of people will come out because it'll be in Birmingham where one fighter is born and the other one hates him. So they'll bring people as well, and they might be in Nottingham. So, it's close to each other. So we'll do that. We'll do those on the side. They're not going to stop promoting just because His Excellency says, I've got this sewn up. So it'll be very interesting, but it does, in my view, because you've only got one, or the feeling is there'll only be one belt per weight class. Some boxers will not make the money that they should.
Now, so, okay, let's talk about that. So if let's say you take the exact model of what the UFC is. Let's say instead of a cage, it's a ring. instead of MMA fighters, it's boxers. But the model is exactly the same, right? Instead of watching that, but UFC puts on shows every single weekend, right? And they've got over 400 contracted fighters. You could definitely see stuff like this. Now, here's where I think it gets interesting. Bonusing. And I was talking about this with Brady, and Brady brought up a very good point about this. Shout out to my co-host from, the Wayans Brothers MMA show and stuff like that. We're talking about this, and he brings up a good point. And the fact of bonusing can come into play a lot. Let's say you've got a lot of these younger fighters, because you're going to get fighters that a lot of up and coming fighters, or a lot of guys that might be coming to the ends of their contracts and don't know what to do, right? Let's say you end up with a Moses Itama. Fantastic. Let's say you end up with Ajit Kabayel. Fantastic. Let's say you end up with some of these guys and they're fighting in this league. And now let's say that they've got a fight, but they've got an opportunity. Maybe they're making $1 million a fight, right? But in bonusing, let's say there's a knockout bonus on every one of these fights. A knockout bonus is $1 million. You think that the Sheikh could afford that? You think that His Excellency could afford $1 million a fight bonus? Now, as a fighter, what does that do to you? You're like, oh, I'm going to get paid $1 million. And if I knock this dude out, I get paid another $1 million.
It's interesting. And my thought, you see, on a league, and you're quite right around UFC. My thought on a league is like, is like the proper football, the soccer, where you'll have around 20 teams. So you'll have one league, and I didn't think we'd have another league. So those people, they're the 20, they won't move up and down, or maybe there'll be a relegation, every year, but or every season. But you're right, it could be a huge league, and you could put some rules behind that kind of bonusing, because at the moment, what people are saying, me included, is those alphabet organizations have got to be cleaned up. They've simply got to be cleaned up, and in fact, boxing's got to be cleaned up generally. And in a way, what His Excellency is saying is, I'll just take control of all this. Well, because I've got the cash.
I think of kind of what he's saying as well is that all of you governing bodies, WBC, WBA, IBF, WBO, all of you people that snubbed the IBO and snubbed Ring, go fuck yourself. How about that? How about no more of this? Now I'm putting myself into bed with somebody who knows how to promote and already has that line set up. Boxing is going to change in a weird way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure he used the phrase "go fuck yourself." I'm not sure he did that. He might have done in private. I didn't see that, but I'll have a look, obviously, because it would be very interesting.
You'd have to slow down the tape, I think.
I think you might.
Now, let's think about this for a second. Let's say you set up a league, right? You've already heard from Canelo Alvarez, who is like, yeah, this is great. Of course it is, because you're going to have a lot of guys that are going to, they're not following boxing. They're following the money. And right now, the money is with His Excellency. So, of course, Canelo's and the Terrence Crawfords, they're talking about this could be the very first fight for this venture, right? But Canelo Alvarez and Terrence Crawford are still under another promoter's contract, right? What does it take to start buying out contracts? That's the next question, because we've seen it happen. I mean, do you remember? Does anybody remember all the money that DAZN gave Canelo for absolutely nothing?
It's an awful lot of cash, and His Excellency has an awful lot of cash. Or does he say, well, I'll actually be a de facto promoter then, and I'll run this league separately to what you're doing, and it'll be really successful, and then you'll have to come along and we can talk about those contracts cheaper, because actually this has been incredibly successful. And listen, I had a thought. Do you think that the belt is all on this, or are you getting points for knockouts and knockdowns and fan reactions? And so you could have someone who's got the belt who's sitting in third place because the person in first place has got more knockouts, hasn't got the belt yet, but fan reaction is great. Click your button now if you like that. Well, then you're at the top of the league, and actually the person who's got the belt is sitting in third. How's it going to work? Because that would be an enormous sea change. But then you're talking about the legitimacy of boxing, aren't you? And that's massive.
Well, yeah, and I mean, let's think about it, because you already have what your WBA rankings are, right? You already have what your IBF rankings are. You already have what your Ring Magazine rankings are for everything else. You also have UFC rankings. UFC has their own rankings, and you know what they actually mean, Steve? Nothing. They mean nothing. We just saw last night where the number 3 guy, okay, was supposed to fight, I think, the number 5 guy or something like that, right? Number 5 guy hurts his hand. So who do they bring in? What makes sense? That's right. The number 11 guy. Rankings don't mean shit. It's a popularity thing. And also you have to look at the consideration of who's available, because it doesn't become a matter of like, if boxer A and boxer B come to an agreement and all of a sudden boxer A pulls out, that fight is done. No, we might be finding a replacement 2 weeks out.
But what you're doing is you're and Eddie Hearn, you're quite right, but Eddie Hearn touched on this, and I know why he did, and more of that in a minute. But what you're doing is you're stopping that Cinderella story, aren't you? Because if you got, correct me if I'm wrong, and I could be wrong because we don't know how this is going to work. But Mr. Padley, Josh Padley, had the call. It's a Cinderella story. He would not be in any kind of league, and he was called because who could you get? Well, he's hanging around, so let's have him. Now, in a league, I presume what you're doing is you're paying. I mean, you'd have to pay some kind of retainer to people, wouldn't you, to be in that league? To say, well, are you around? Are you still sparring? Are you keeping Jim ready because you might be fighting this person? Or if we need you, we'll call you from the league. You might be at the bottom of the league, but that Cinderella story would not happen. And that's a big part of boxing because that electrician could have won. He might have won. He could have got a lucky punch and he could have won. And he could be a champion, in very short order. So you lose that. It's more of a predetermined situation because you know who's in that league, unless I'm looking at this totally incorrectly.
Let me throw this at you then, because this has happened in the UFC before, where they had a guy. It was Michel Pereira is his name. He was supposed to be fighting a gentleman, ended up pulling out. They pull in a fighter from last minute, happens to be a local guy, Vancouver, BC fight or something like that. But he was like plus 5 million to win this thing. And he comes in, like he's not even a contracted fighter with the UFC. They just give him, they sign him because he's been rotating around on the independent circuit, and they fight him, and he ends up beating Michel Pereira because he took him too lightly. There's a ton of small promotions out there. Now let's put it to you this way. You've got a guy that we both are very familiar with, right? That I've had him on the show, before. Ryan Rozicki has been gracious enough to give us some of his time. There's a perfect example, in my opinion, of a guy who, where he is, this isn't a knock on his promotion, or anything like that, or his management or anything like that. But Ryan Rozicki is a guy who may end up aging out of the fight game before he gets a chance to be seen by the amount of people that should see him. And I'm just using his name as an example. You've got guys like Eduardo Nunes, unbelievable. Rafael Espinoza, who's like a 6'1" featherweight, who's probably one of the most underrated fighters in the world. but people may not get a chance to know who this guy is, right? But you open up this league that has this kind of promotional backing behind it, and now all of a sudden they can start drawing these people from these local circuits, from these smaller promotions, to make stars, because that's what they've done in MMA, right?
Yes, and it's a good point. And if you're going to have a bigger league, if you're going to have, a league of 20, 30, 40, then that's a different matter. But Eddie Hearn, and I take your point, but Eddie Hearn made another point. He made the flip side point, which is all these fighters who are aging are not going to get the opportunity to fight for a title. Now, part of that is about, with the alphabet promotions, I can make loads of pay-per-views. And I can make more money, because I might have 3 heavyweight prospects in my stable. He doesn't, but he might have, and he can make money on all of those, because you've got so many alphabets, and there's such a shit show around that I can make big pay-per-views on those. Now you couldn't do that with a league, and plus he makes a point about, is that going to affect boxers, as you say, you're getting older. And they may come to people's attention, but there may be those people who are just about to become really huge and make big money, and they don't get a chance to do that because they're having to work their way up the league and are being kept down in that respect. Now, that means those boxers wouldn't make the big money. I care about promoters. I deeply care about promoters, obviously. That whether Frank Warren gets pate foie gras every night keeps me awake. I worry about the money for promoters, but I really worry about boxers getting their money. I've said many times, this is a hurt business. And every time you step in there, you can lose your livelihood in your life. So I want those boxers to get as much money as possible. If they're not fighting for the title, then what Eddie Hearn says is, well, you might not get that chance. Linked to that is the money, unless His Excellency is going to say, as you say, here's the bonus, and here's your remuneration package, and it's massive. No matter what you fight for, the title is just about fighting for that belt. It's not about fighting for the money. That would be a game changer.
And see, that's really, because we talk about the belt, right? And that belt, and realistically, I personally think that it's going to be called the Undisputed Boxing League. That seems to be his belt, seem undisputed. Right. It's a really good word because everybody talks about it. Right. You are the undisputed champion. So it puts him ahead of the game already, because they haven't come up with a name. So it probably won't be that because I said it. But the reality is that what Eddie Hearn is saying to me is that he's mad because his fighters won't get a chance to fight for that undisputed belt unless they're in that league, which, if you read between the lines, Eddie, means I want your money and nothing else. I think what he's more afraid of isn't the boxers, because the boxers will survive. A boxer will survive with or without a promoter, because you know what the boxer can go and do? He can go get another promoter. And he's going to do that. I think what Eddie Hearn is kind of alluding to maybe a little bit is that the world we know of for that typical boxing promoter is going to go away. I think that's what it might be that he's a little bit more scared of. Who knows?
And I think you're right. And if you're a promoter who's done his bit for many years, like Frank Warren, and has overcome a shooting allegedly from another boxer, actually not allegedly, from another boxer, and has come back stronger than ever, then it might be time to hang up your promoter's license. He might think, okay, I've made my money. I'll go on the circuit, and he'll be a sage head, and he's great to listen to. If you're Ben Shalom, then you're young enough to be able to say, actually, I can work with this, because actually I can work with His Excellency and with Dana White, and I'll cut some deals, and I know what I'm doing. He's not so established as far as being ossified. He's young enough to do that. He's inexperienced, young enough to do that. But Eddie Hearn He's right in the middle of that. He's neither a Frank Warren situation and he's not new either. Right in the middle, making his way. And for him, it's got to look absolutely terrible.
Well, I mean, you look at some of the guys that Boxer, right? Ben Shalom's company is bringing in, and we've talked about him here. You've got your Ben Whitakers of the world. I mean, you've got Chris Eubanks Jr., who's a little older as well for the experience. So Ben Shalom is a perfect example. Martin Bacoli is a guy that they have. Chris Billum Smith, who, as we all know, a good cruiserweight champion. Like, there's a guy who's got young talent that could be very, very prosperous talent, right? Because let's face facts. As good of a fighter as a guy like a Ben Whitaker might turn out to be, very much Prince Asim. We've been there before. But there seems to be a ceiling on that. So you want to capitalize on that for your fighter as a ceiling, and you want to go where the money goes. So you don't piss anybody off. You're young in the game, and you stick to where the money's going. You're like, yeah, Sheiky, I got you, boo. Hey, Dana, need a shine on that head of yours? I got you, boo. Let's go. Right? You do what you can to make sure your fighters are staying taken care of. And I think that the ego of a lot of the old timers, and I'm only talking from what I know from experience in the world of professional wrestling, because it happens there too. The ego of the old timers might get in the way. And that's where somebody like an Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, Bob Arum, those guys definitely a Don King. See you later.
Yeah, I mean, leaving aside Don King, because he's not really in the market as much now, but certainly Frank Warren, as I say, has done his bit, and when he speaks, you listen.
Right.
But if you look at Ben Shalom, he's got good social media game and is intelligent to listen to, as is Eddie Hearn, but he doesn't do what Eddie Hearn does. He keeps withdrawn in that way. So he hasn't. I'm not saying that Eddie Hearn's burnt any bridges, but what I'm saying is he's got a kind of paraffin in his hand, and he's standing by the bridge, saying at any point I can go on social media. Here's a match, and Ben Shalom doesn't do that. So he is a better opportunity, as you say, for Sheiky and for Dana White to say, well, I could work with this guy. But as I say, it's got to be very, very worrying for Eddie Hearn.
It's a bit of a dicking swinging contest too at this point still. You know what I mean? Like, it's a measuring stick for sure between Eddie and Dana. They've had conversations in the past, right? And now it's going to be like, oh, who's going to have the upper hand in this situation? Well, Dana's already got the upper hand because he's the one that made the deal. And it's not the Eddie Hearn, and we haven't even talked about this one yet. How about this example? Because there's going to be companies that he either has to work with, right? That he's going to draw from, like we talked about the Ryan Rozicki's of the world, some of these smaller promotions. And when we're talking some of these smaller promotions, there's one promotion out there that he has gone on record of saying how much he does not like the person who runs said promotion. And I'm not talking about Oscar De La Hoya at all. No. I'm talking about your good friend, Jake Paul. There's a guy who has a promotion, who has everything that we've just been talking about for the last 30 minutes of what Dana White and His Excellency would be looking for, right? And all of this, get into the world of boxing, Dana, that Jake Paul has been spewing, and Dana's just kept his mouth shut the entire time. And now he's not only just in it with a big toe, because Jake was like, he'll get in it with a toe and he'll be like a Vince McMahon trying to do, bodybuilding contests or the XFL. It's not going to happen. It's not going to go well for him. And I can give him the I told you so. Well, he just came in with the biggest dick swinging and the biggest bag of money you could possibly had and told Jake Paul, step aside, child. Let me show you what it's like when real businessmen get involved with real business.
And you're right, from Jake Paul's consideration, it finishes it all. This feeds into my influencer boxing is finished this time next year comment, and I stand by that. because this is about, if it's the business of boxing, and that's what Jake Paul is part. He's got a bit of a dichotomy, hasn't he? I love boxing. Well, it's about the business of boxing. It's about the boxing. But this, as you say, there's a big bag of money, and Jake Paul saying that bag's bigger than mine. My ball bag isn't as big as that. So that's bigger. Yeah, that's what it's all about. And it makes you look a bit smaller, mate. So that's going to take over. The league, if they continue with this, which they will, of course, is going to take over. And it's going to be the big story in boxing. Influence of boxing has been, but this will be bigger.
Yeah, and this is everything that MVP has been talking about. He's got his, even Mayweather Promotions. They've got their version of their up and comers, their contender series that they already do. But the UFC already does it, and the UFC already does it on a bigger scale. It's not as much money, but it's on a bigger promotional scale. And you know as well as I do, Steve, at the end of the day, 90% of the fighters, 90% of the boxers, 90% of the wrestlers out there are a bunch of ego-driven twats. And they're more concerned about how many eyeballs they have on them as opposed to how many Benjamins they have in their bank account.
I'm interested to see if you say there's a league and you say we're capping it at the first level at 30 boxers. How many of those big names do you say, you're too troublesome? Or I don't think it's worthwhile for me. You've been a bit lackluster. We're not having you. Maybe we'll trade you in down the line if you do some more work and we can see it's okay. But there will be some big names missing. Mm-hmm. I feel sure if they say, well, you're not in, but this one that we've only actually heard a little bit about, you can come in, but you're not there. That's going to be huge.
Yeah. Listen, I'm all for it. I'm interested to see once they get the process rolling. Clearly, a lot of people are talking about it just from this beginning stages. You know what I mean? I want to see what fighters they're going to end up getting, because I don't think it's going to be as many of these big name fighters as you think. I think that, within the last couple of days, these promoters have been on the phone with their fighters going, hey, just saying hello. Don't get too overexcited. You still have a contract. So then there's going to be that whole thing like we talked about buying out contracts. And is it worth it to have that contract bought out? I think that you could end up seeing a lot of boxers age themselves out of the business, because as well as I do, there's a very fine line. And we've said how many times, oh man, we never got to see this fight, that fight. Why didn't they make it happen? Well, because they're a bunch of twats who couldn't make it happen in the boardroom. So we couldn't make it happen in the boxing ring. And that happens. And we talk about that B of the business of boxing. Well, we won't have that over here.
No, and what you also won't have is situations like, well, we have to have this fight. I mean, it's lackluster. I'm talking to you, Gervonta Davis. Talking to you, it's lackluster, and you pull shenanigans, and it's okay. And the New York Athletic Commission have said it's okay because it didn't affect the outcome, that he wasn't Dr. Point. What? All of this kind of stuff makes me think that, well, I don't really want you in this league. Perhaps something like that. All of that shenanigan would be stopped, because if you're saying, well, okay, you're a big name, and we've got some people who are not such big names, but by dint of being in this super league, the undisputed league, makes you look bigger. So actually, is Gervonta that good? Is Ryan that good? Are they that good? Because actually, is it just hype? Because these are just as good now that it looks like they're bigger. That's really interesting too.
Yeah, and we already have that. They have that model already with what they do in the UFC. They already have that. We already have these kinds of storylines and matchups. I'm going to be doing another a video that's coming out very shortly where I'm going to be talking about exactly that, where it's not necessarily the man who you think is going to be, who's deserving. It's not always the number one fighting the number two. Sometimes it's the number one fighting the number four. And don't get it twisted. over here, world of boxing, you prima donna bitches, all right? Because you do it too. Your number one guy, your cream of the crop, your little gingery son of a moho, Canelo Alvarez, I mean, let's not say that he hasn't cherry-picked a couple of fights. Floyd Mayweather cherry-picked a couple of fights. We're talking about a business here where you've got to be an undefeated prima donna with 30-plus wins before you can even get a sniff. Well, now you're going to get to see guys that are like, 1-1, 2-2, but they're fighting. And these guys are fighting for like notoriety and to get out there 100%.
Well, the thing is, Mr. T, and you're quite right. I think Mr. T, crazy fool, not that Mr. T, this Mr. T, ain't good on no plea. I think this is like professional wrestling because you lock it down into a league. And so it's quite airless. And so you think this person fighting this person's going to fight this person. If it works that way, then you, as you say, you get your storylines and your angles and you confect something. And the business of boxing works in that way. That is very professional wrestling. It works incredibly well if it works that way. It could be a complete and utter disaster, but it looks like if they get the money right, because I'm concerned about boxers getting paid properly, if they get the money right, then this might end all of that nonsense that we talk about every week.
Well, I personally think that this whole thing is going to run mirror to what the UFC runs. The UFC already has bonuses. They've got over 400 fighters. Could you imagine now you're a boxer going, holy shit, I could actually get a contracted job with a league where I'm on contract as well, right? With a fighting contract, which is going to have to be a little bit different. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting. Yeah, fight. That's what you wanted to do. That's why you got into the business. You didn't get into the business to fight once a year, you pussy. You got into this business to fight, right? So do it. I think that's going to be the interesting part. I wish them all the best of luck on this one, man. I can't wait to see how all of this goes down, right? Steve, what are we going to do about all of this? I mean, we got big fights coming up, though, too, right? We still got monster fights coming up. We've got a lot of stuff that we want to talk about. One of the things that I want to talk about to you going in the future here, maybe next week we'll talk about this. Japanese fighters, why don't they leave Japan? Why is it taking so long for Inoue to get these fights? And why are we so disappointed with the fights that he's taking?
This is part of the business of boxing, and it's part of the Super A side. We will talk about this, but this is an A side to beat no other. To beat all of them, should I say? But that's what you do. Everyone wants to bring their fighter up slowly, and you can. And when you say, "Well, we'll just keep you in this country," and consequently, that's how we'll bring you up, and then we can. It's a microcosm situation. Yes, I'm looking forward to speaking with you and your supreme knowledge very soon about that.
Well, I mean, it's definitely not supreme, and I don't know how knowledgeable it is, but there's a lot of shit floating around in there, and I just try to get it to go from here out to here without falling into my own lap, so to speak. You know what I mean?
You managed that today, and that is a bonus for everybody.
Thank you so much, Steve. As always, a pleasure. Please, if you haven't yet, go check him out. World Weary Guy 1 on all of those socials. He's everywhere. What are we talking about music-wise this week?
This week, what do I have this week? Yesterday, I did Lady Gaga's new album, which I'm disappointed with. I'm disappointed. I referenced Madonna. I referenced Kylie Minogue. All of the divas are there. And this week, we have to dip into the past. We have Jethro Tull's new album, which, well, you'll have to listen to see how I feel about it. But look at this face. So you'll have to see how you feel. I mean, I've interviewed Ian Anderson, and I love the Gentleman Dealey. He's a very intelligent gentleman, and I love their music. I'm the one who likes that Under Wraps album from the 80s. I'm the only one in the world. So I'm talking about that plus wrestling and a Paranormal Activity horror movie that might have passed you by.
Interesting. Well, not every album can be an Aqualung, my friend. Right? Not everyone.
No, it can't. It can't. Or a Broadsword and the Beast. I could talk all day.
There we go. Tremendous. Steve, as always, thank you so much. For all of the rest of you, please hit that like, hit that subscribe. You can check out the Wayans Brothers. There's some wrestling stuff. There's more boxing stuff. All of that over on What's a Work. Also, my personal stuff over at Tid Talk. All of these things are on YouTube, where we've been, I think it was referred to as Transcast. That's what we're calling it nowadays. We're calling it Transcast because it's so many different opportunities to see it. I think that kind of makes sense. That does kind of make sense a little bit. So to you, to yours, enjoy the rest of your day. If you've watched this later afterwards, then, share it with a friend. We're nice. I mean, half of us here have a respectable looking face, and the other half is me. So one thing you've got to remember, that underneath, this somewhat of a beard, just trying to make up for that full thing that of manliness that Steve Swift has going on, underneath it, you got to remember one thing, ladies and gentlemen. You know what that is, Steve? You got to tuck that chin, my brother.